So, welcome everyone to this great debate on Arctic environmental change, threats and opportunities. My name is Jonathan Bamber. I'm president of EGU, but also I'm a polar scientist, glaciologist by background, and I've done a lot of work in the Arctic, and this is a topic of keen interest to me, so that's one of the reasons I'm chairing this session. The way we're going to run this is that I'll introduce our panel. We have an absolutely stellar list of panelists to discuss all aspects of the topic. They're going to speak to the issues for around about 5 minutes each, and then we're going to open up the discussion to the floor, and we very much welcome questions from the audience. And so, I don't know, those of you sitting right at the back, do come forward. Maybe get a little bit closer. It's quite a big room, and don't be shy. But there will be about half the time we have available. We want to allow you to ask questions to the panel and raise issues. So I'll just start by running through the kind of rationale behind the great debate, and then I'll introduce our speakers. So the Arctic is currently warming at twice the global average, and I'm sure all of you kind of know all this, but it's resulting in possibly the clearest and most dramatic signs of climate change seen in the observational record. An ice-free Arctic Ocean in summer is imminent. If you went to one of the sessions earlier on this week, maybe in just 20 years' time. Permafrost is thawing and taking place with impacts on coastal erosion, the built environment, ecosystems, and potentially dangerous climate feedbacks. Alterations to ocean circulation as a consequence of Arctic environmental change may have wide-scale climate impacts. These changes, however, also offer new opportunities for resource exploration, exploitation, and employment. New shipping routes create opportunities to Arctic nations, but also threats from pollution and introduction of foreign marine species. So that's kind of the context. And some of the things that we want to discuss in the next hour and a half are, for example, what will the new Arctic environments look like? What future are there for Arctic populations? How will changes in the Arctic affect the rest of the planet? Is exploitation of natural resources a benefit or a threat to local populations? What does sustainable and responsible resource exploitation actually look like and mean? So those are some of the things that we're going to put to the panelists, and you no doubt have lots of other questions. So I'll start by just introducing the panel in a reasonably random order, not as they're written down here rather than lined up there. So Christiana Figueres was the Executive Secretary of UNFCCC from 2010 to 2016, and she was central, as I'm sure you all know, in negotiating COP21 agreement. She's now, most recently, founder of Mission 2020, which is based in London. Aslak Holmberg is a Vice President of the Sami Council, which represents part of the indigenous populations in the Arctic. Nyland Koch is Research Director at Norwegian Polar Institute in Tromsø. Erling Kvadsheim is the Director for International Affairs at Norwegian Oil and Gas, and they represent the whole oil and gas sector in Norway. Julianne Struve, sorry, I get it wrong every time. Julianne Struve is a Professor of Polar Science at University College London. Before that, she was at National Snow and Ice Data Centre in Boulder. And Gail Whiteman is a Professor of Sustainability in Business at Lancaster University in the UK. So we have a very broad range of expertise and interests on the panel, and hopefully we're going to have a really lively discussion on this. And we're going to kick off with a little bit about some of the environmental impacts and threats from Arctic environmental change, from, if you like, the climate scientists, go on to some of the policy-related issues and sustainability issues, and then talk about some of the opportunities and impacts on Indigenous people, and also opportunities for Indigenous people. So that's sort of roughly the order we'll run it in. And if I could ask the panelists to try and stick to around about 5 minutes each for kind of introductory remarks, that would be brilliant. If it goes on to 2 or 3, okay, 2 or 3, fantastic, okay, all right, brilliant. So, Nylan, do you want to kick off?
Sure.
Okay. There's two mics. Oh, you can use this one, yeah.
I'll use that.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me to this debate. I would like to argue for that this is the time to increase our observations and research in understanding the Arctic mechanisms, couplings between the systems and regions. And this is not because we do not know enough to take action, but we still need to know quite a bit for better projections in the future. We have just yesterday had a launching of a new report from Arctic Council, AMAP group, called SWEPA. And the key findings of this assessment is a confirmation of the rapidly changing Arctic, and Julian will go into the sea ice part of it, but I can also add that the recent recognition of additional melt processes affecting Arctic and Antarctic glaciers, ice sheets suggest that low-end projections of global sea level rise made by the IPCC are underestimated, which means that we are also looking for increased sea level rise into the future. Climate change in the Arctic has continued at a rapid and increasing pace. The global the Arctic temperatures are rising faster than the global average. January 2016 in the Arctic was 5 degrees warmer than the 2010 average for the region. And we are also seeing that the frequency of some extreme events is changing. And all these changes are also affecting the atmospheric and ocean circulation, our weather patterns. So one reason to increase our observations is in a system that is rapidly changing, we need much tighter follow of the state of the system in order to make better predictions for the future. But we also need, for sustainable development in this area, science-based management advice. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, that was exactly 2 minutes. Julianne. Or there's a mic. Use one of the 2 mics there. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, turn him on.
Is that on? No.
I think so, yeah.
I think so. Yeah? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Is it on? Okay, great. Yeah, so, you know, for a long time, scientists have understood that if we were going to see climate change happening, and we would see it first in the polar regions. But I have to say, when I was a PhD student in the 1990s, and I was doing my work in Greenland, I certainly wasn't concerned about climate change at that point. But in the 2000s, we just started seeing one year after another with record low sea ice conditions, enhanced Greenland melting. And, you know, as a scientist, I started really looking at, well, what is going on? Because natural climate variability no longer seemed to be a good explanation for what was happening. And I think as scientists, we've been coming to understand that, you know, greenhouse gases and the warming from that is really driving a lot of these accelerated changes that we're seeing in the Arctic. And I think one of the concerns that I've had is that a lot of these changes are happening faster than our models have been able to forecast. And when I think about, for example, the Arctic Ocean, which has been perennially ice covered for, you know, hundreds, if not thousands, or even longer timescales, it's a real possibility now that the Arctic Ocean is going to become ice-free in summers during my lifetime. And we can see this by just even looking at the relationship between Arctic sea ice and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that with another 1,000 gigatons of carbon, we're going to have an Arctic Ocean that is ice-free in summers. And this means, I think, when we're looking at the the agreements in Paris and trying to limit our warming, we really have to keep that warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius if we want to keep the Arctic sea ice. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and you know, I fear, I think as a scientist, that it's going to be too late in many ways, that we are going to see these profound transformations, and we don't fully understand all the implications of this. Everything on the planet is interconnected, and so these changes in the energy balance in the Arctic is going to have widespread implications, not just locally in the Arctic, but also globally in terms of our weather patterns, our oceanic circulation patterns. I think as a scientist, too, one of my concerns right now is that the funding for observations seems to be going down. For example, when I look at the sea ice record, which is one of our longest climate data records we have out there, the satellites that we base that record on, at least in the United States, the observations are discontinuing. So we're not launching follow-on satellites that will continue these monitor the sea ice, at least the way that we have been doing it in the past. So I think there's a real concern in the science community about maintaining a lot of these observations so that we can better understand and predict how these changes are going to impact the rest of the planet.
Great, thanks Julianne. Christiana.
Thank you, both of you, and good morning to all. I wanted to pick up on your interconnected, Julian, because I think we need to keep that front and center. Yes, the changes in the Arctic are truly scary. They are horrifying what we're seeing. And, it's not a but, and at the same time, we have to remember that it's not just changes in the Arctic. It is changes in coral reefs that currently are already practically disappearing, except for very few. It is changes in the acidity and the temperature of oceans. It is changes in the melting of glaciers. It's already affecting, as you mentioned, ocean circulation. So all of these, as we know, are deeply, deeply interconnected. And sometimes we fall into the default of thinking only one ecosystem or one piece of the puzzle. But the fact is that all of these are interconnected and are changing very, very rapidly and are affecting each other in scaling up the speed of change, which goes to my second point. What we're really looking at here is the delta between speed and scale of change versus adaptability. That's what we're really looking at. What is the delta between those two? And frankly, here is the really difficult part for us all to accept. It is certainly about the changes in the planet, but we have to accept that the planet will be able to adapt. Humans will not. And ultimately, it is about the well-being of humans on this planet, or in fact, even human existence on this planet, if we take it too far. Because I guarantee that the spectrum of adaptability of the planet, as she has shown for millions of years, is much, much wider than the spectrum of adaptability of human beings. And so when we go into the science and the effects on any of the natural ecosystems, we have to always make the link and make the arc to what does this mean for human beings? Because ultimately, that is what we're talking about. And these tipping points that we're already seeing, they are knocking at our door. We are looking at tipping points that could be completely irreversible, as you've mentioned, are definitely systemic, and could really be a threat to our existence on this planet. Unless, of course, we have plans to exit and go somewhere else, which is also, you know, among the distant possibilities. But as long as we're planning to stay here, we really have to always make the link to what does that mean for those of us who are planning to stay on the mothership.
Thanks for that. Some interesting points.
Absolutely. Well, I'm here to stay on the mothership. I don't know about the rest of the audience, but I definitely am. I'm a business school professor, and I work with senior executives, CEOs, to try and understand global risk around sustainability. I did my PhD in the subarctic, and I've worked with the Arctic science community for many years. And the positioning that my team does is that the Arctic is a barometer of global risk. So as we take a look at Arctic change, it's massive, it's observational, it's concrete. I try to take that message into the boardroom, not to exploit further business opportunities, but actually to have senior executives around the world understand that this is going to pose economic risks for them. So for example, if I'm going in to talk to a CEO of an agricultural company, in their planning process, of course, they're looking at all kinds of different risks. Climate change would be part of that. But I try to actually bring in the Arctic directly to say we need to take a look at how the Arctic specifically is changing and better understand the teleconnections, the interconnections with weather patterns and extreme weather and other events around the world to understand risk perspective. I also would do that to the insurance industry. I would do that to the shipping industry, which often sees the Arctic as a benefit. It's a shorter shipping route. But we do know that depending on how we ship, especially if we still use heavy fuel, we are going to actually increase economic risk around the world because of increased climate change, because of the short-lived pollutants that would be exposed in the Arctic. So the world is interconnected, and the global economic world is definitely interconnected. And the message that we're trying to bring with my team is to estimate those economic risks using the natural science of things like SWEPA, of Juliana's work, and many others to really understand that risk. And that message is coming home. This year we took the Arctic Base Camp to Davos, the World Economic Forum annual meeting on global risk. We brought Arctic scientists. Juliana was one of them. We camped there. We set up a weather haven tent. We had keynote speakers. I'm very proud to have Christiana Figueres here again today. She was one of our keynotes, as was Mr. Al Gore. And we really talked about, here's the science, here are the economic risks and societal risks globally, and then let's try and get to the problem solving. Now, I don't think we quite got to how we would solve that problem, but it was the first step. So that's the kind of work that I do, is that the Arctic, to me, is a barometer of global risk. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Gail. Erling.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I represent the oil and gas industry, the Norwegian oil and gas industry, and I just want to make a couple of fairly obvious statements to kick off the discussion. One, and thank you, Jonathan, for allowing me to show this picture at the back. You can all see that it is one of these composite satellite images of the globe at night, seen from above the North Pole. And what that illustrates is that there are different Arctics, or different parts of the Arctic, and that is important. There is the Russian Arctic that we know, the vast Russian Arctic, with their vast shallow seas that are now opening up to shipping, at least for parts of the year. There is the North American and Greenland Arctic with its quite complex geography, ice cover, part of it ice covered all year, part of it ice covered part of the year. And there's the European Arctic, which for practical purposes is ice-free all year round. And interwoven in those three Arctics, there's also the indigenous Arctic, the peoples of the Arctic. So there are various, in the discussion of the Arctic, there are various perspectives you can take. If you look at the European part of the Arctic that I work in or work for, there has been industrial activity there for many, many years. There are modern, well-developed societies. There are lots of people living there. And the conditions are fairly benign compared to some of the other parts of the Arctic. And what we have shown, for instance, in the oil and gas industry for the last 40 years, that responsible exploitation of resources in the Arctic region is possible. The second point I want to make, and that's also an obvious one, but I really want to stress it, that the climate challenge is global, it's real, it's happening right now, as we have heard, as you all know, and we have heard descriptions already from the panel. We need to discuss that, or to meet this challenge based on facts and based on strong, solid science. But it is global. And although we see some of the most severe effects of the climate change in the Arctic, we need to focus our mitigating initiatives where it actually has the highest effect. And that is not always. And that, as a matter of fact, that is mostly in other parts of the world than in the Arctic. That is the second point I want to make. The third point is that the world's demand for natural resources and for energy is growing. The world population is growing rapidly, and it will continue to grow throughout the century. The world population is developing. Large parts of the world are moving out of poverty, and that means that they would require much more energy, much more natural resources. And the Arctic, being such a large part of the globe, has a role to play. The Arctic is a very resource-rich region for minerals, metals, oil and gas, fish, huntable mammals for that matter. And the important thing is to find responsible ways of exploiting those natural resources to the benefit of the world and to the benefit of the people living in the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Erling.
Yes, thank you, and good morning to everybody. So Sami Council is one of the permanent participants in the Arctic Council, and obviously we represent the Sami people there. And I'm also gonna refer to this SWIPA report that was it Naylen who mentioned it, and to bring some concrete examples on what could be the impacts on indigenous peoples and especially reindeer herding communities in the Arctic. So this is something we all know, is that winters are getting shorter, and it means that the snow and ice will break sooner, and this will force some impacts on the reindeer migration routes. There will be a need for alternate routes, and perhaps there will be more pressure for the summer pastures, since the summers will be longer. There will be more freezing and thawing periods during the winter, which means that there will be impenetrable layers of snow and ice, so that the reindeer cannot dig for food through the snow. And this also creates the need for alternate pastures and some extra feeding. The tree line will probably move higher, and even though reindeer actually help to mitigate this impact, because the reindeer eat the branches, the bushes that grow, and you know, now when it's pure white tundra, then it reflects all the light, but if there is a bush, then it sucks more of the heat. So reindeer, to an extent, slow down this impact, but anyway, it could be that the tree line moves higher, which means that there is less space for the reindeer to go and escape the insects to a treeless, windy areas. Yeah, so the extractive industries, they compete over the same areas that traditional livelihoods of indigenous peoples also are using. And when we are looking at the Arctic for development projects that require some changes in the land use, it's important to think about the impacts, let's say, for reindeer herding communities, that they are not only considered solely on the size of that one development project, but that the accumulated impacts are taken into account. And these environmental changes are also part of this pressure for those livelihoods. And to remain resilient, reindeer herding also needs to be flexible and face these changes. So to protect the Arctic environment and promote sustainable use and development in the region, all societies must be taken to be in the position to be able to utilize these opportunities, and no one has to be left only with the challenges. And when we look at the Arctic, we have to remember that it's not an empty place that is waiting for investments and developments and industries, but there are some sustainable economies, and it cannot be always that it is the traditional economies of indigenous peoples that are getting smaller while other economies get bigger. And yes, so we have to remember what development means to different people. For some it can mean encroachment, while others it's development for the better. But yes, I think I should stop now.
Oh well, thank you very much for that. That's like I've got a long list of questions, issues, and potential conflicts raised by that, and I'll kick off with some of those, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But please, 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 you know, give our panel some tough questions. You know, ask them those hard questions that you really want the answer to. And while you're thinking about those, I'll kick off. So, I mean, I've heard a number of things here. I think certainly the audience, and I'm sure the panel, are fully behind desiring or wanting the need to decarbonize our economies and societies. I think we probably all agree on that and the importance of doing that. But on the other hand, I think, I don't know, 99% of the people attending this conference got here using fossil fuels, okay? And we can't have it both ways. And right now, we're not in a place where we can entirely rely on renewable resources to live and to operate. And, Erling will know better than me, but something like 25% of unexploited or unexplored oil and gas reserves lie in the Arctic. Why should we make the Arctic special? Why exclude the Arctic from those opportunities rather than somewhere else in the world? And I think we can't have it both ways. That's one of the things. Another issue that came up is that, and Julianne talked to this a little bit, and Nyland as well. There are teleconnections. The climate system is interconnected. But if I'm a policymaker, I have a long list of things I need to worry about if I'm a government. I have a risk register which probably runs to thousands. And if I don't know what the risk is from, let's say, an ice-free Arctic, then I don't know how worried I should be about it. And I think that is, a major concern. Other things, I mean, so we heard from Aslak about some of the impacts from the rest of the world, the impacts of global climate change on the Arctic, and then there's the converse of that, the impacts of Arctic environmental change on the rest of the world. And those are two very different things. And actually, and how we tackle those and the implications of those are very different. And I'd be interested to know actually whether the Sami Council supports extractive industries in the Arctic or not. And so that's a question that I'll just put out there now. So those were some of the things that I think cropped up. There were quite a few others, but does anyone want to sort of kick off? So Julianne, I mean, a very senior scientist said to me, well, ice-free Arctic, so what? And all right, there will be some consequences for ocean ecosystems. There will be some impact on the wider climate, but what are those impacts?
If I had the answer to that question, I think I could retire. But well, I think obviously it's a very complex system. If I were to think about maybe one of the immediate impacts that I think would be most relevant to many people around the world, and that would be the fact that because the Arctic is warming so much faster than the rest of the planet, in part because we're losing the sea ice cover and the snow on land is melting sooner, and we have this positive ice albedo feedback effect, one of the things that that is doing is it's enhancing the melting of things like Greenland and other glaciers and ice caps in the Arctic. So this has a direct impact on sea level rise. Even though, you know, melting the sea ice won't affect it directly, indirectly it does through warming the Arctic even further. So that, I think, is one of those first sort of things that we can definitely pinpoint that is going to have a huge impact on coastal communities around the planet. In terms of changes in mid-latitude weather, and we're thinking about extreme weather events, this is a much more difficult question to answer. And it's, you know, as a scientist and looking at, you know, how fast this field is moving as we're trying to better understand all of these teleconnection patterns, I would say almost every week a new paper is coming out on this topic. Mm-hmm. And, you know, they have sometimes very conflicting results. Some of them show very clear links between changes in the Arctic and changes in extreme weather events and maybe cold spell outbreaks in North America or in Northern Europe. And other studies say that perhaps it's not directly linked to sea ice loss yet, for example, or Arctic warming. And part of it is that we need, I think, as a science community to come together and have sort of a very coordinated set of modeling experiments where we use the climate models in a consistent way with the same sort of setup and experiments so we can really better understand, you know, what are the feedbacks and you know, how robust are the results
I'm going to interject there. So I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but that's the stock answer. Give me more money to do more research. And I think, you know, with the policymakers, the politicians, they need to take action now, as we've heard, and we know all that. They do need, you know, they need to know what the impacts are to know how seriously to take them.
Right, but at the same time, it's, you know, we understand as scientists the inherent uncertainty in a lot of these forecasts, and so I think that that's always been a challenge, I think, with the science communication and to communicate what we think is going to happen versus our uncertainties in those projections. And I think, for example, with Arctic sea ice, a lot of times what policymakers want to know is they want us to give them that exact date as to when the Arctic Ocean will become ice-free, for example. And that is something that, you know, maybe has an uncertainty of about plus or minus 20 years. But yet the impacts of that are going to be profound. It's...
Okay. Yeah, well, Christiana, then Nolan, I think.
So I would argue, yes, we need more science. Yes, we need more data. And at the same time, we don't need science perfection before we can assess economic and human disaster, frankly. And I think that that was the message that came loud and clear from the Paris Agreement, where admittedly there is not 100% certainty, but there is a lot of certainty, and there is enough certainty for governments, not just a few governments, but for 195 governments who have decided, okay, we understand that there is enough risk here that we actually have to do something about it, and we have to intentionally change the course of the evolution of the economy around the world. And that is the summary of the Paris Agreement. And they decided in the Paris Agreement that, therefore, we are going to be at a decarbonized society by 2050. In fact, the article says in the second half of the century, because it wasn't politically viable at that point to say by rather than in the second half. But by now, we understand that it is by 2050. And by now, we understand that in order to be at a decarbonized society by 2050, that means we have to get to the maximum point of global emissions, because we're 3 years running into flat greenhouse gases, but that is not enough. We actually have to start to bend the curve and decrease emissions, and that inflection point has to come not in 2050, 40, 30, in 2020, because we are already almost exhausted the carbon budget that we have. So even if we do have fossil fuel reserves in the ground, they're going to have to stay cozily down there where they are right now. Okay. Because we just cannot afford to continue to extract them, whether they are in the Arctic or anywhere else.
Do you want to address Erling's specific point, which was demand for resources, not just fossil fuel, but, you know, other resources? So, you know, perhaps the largest untapped uranium resources in the world lie in Greenland, and, you know, the demand for those are growing.
Well, and not only demand for those are growing, but population is growing. So here is the fact is that we stand at an incredible crossroads that is, A, the greatest risk that we've ever seen, but it's also the greatest opportunity that we've ever seen. And that piece we do not focus on enough. Because yes, we're having 2 billion more brothers and sisters joining us very soon. And we're going to have increasing needs for energy, for minerals, et cetera, et cetera. What we have to understand is that we're going to have to exponentially increase the economic output, the efficiency, the impact of every single one of our natural resources per capita or per GDP. We cannot have the irresponsible productivity that we've had from energy or from any of the minerals. We're going to have to extract much more productivity per GDP or per capita so that we can then contain the use of our natural resources within the planetary boundaries while providing for the well-being of everyone who's going to be joining us in addition to those who are already here. So it's about increasing the productivity. It is not about extracting without any boundaries, because we've already reached the planetary boundaries on most, if not all of those.
I think Nylan and then Gail.
Okay, as I said in my introduction, we know enough to take action, and we have to take action. But we do not need to polarize between the need to take action and the need for more knowledge. And to answer your question regarding what will be the impact of an Arctic without ice, as Julian said very well, we do not know. And we cannot live with the fact that we do not know how the Arctic will look like physically, chemically, biologically. We do not know how that Arctic looks like into the future. And we are in a great transition period. And we will come there by 2040? Yes, the new numbers. So we have to know what that Arctic is going to look like and how that Arctic the ocean is going to impact the rest of the oceans, the rest of the atmospheric circulation. This has to do with the risks we are talking about. Without knowing how our climate is going to change into the future, it's difficult to adapt.
Gail?
I think that the important thing for science and for Arctic countries to understand is that global business is shifting. The old-style business model of let's just take whatever resources are available and limit as much of the damage as possible and call that responsible stewardship is really massively changing. Many CEOs reject that model. There's a huge movement towards deep decarbonization. With all due respect, there is a lot of oil and gas reserves around the world. The Arctic certainly has some of those, but I would suggest that many of those are going to be stranded assets. That's an accounting term where you've got stuff that's no longer worth anything because you can't afford to pay for the externalities. Now, I'm not saying necessarily accountants are going to save the planet, but they're an incredibly powerful force. And we've seen, and that's not my words, those are Peter Bacher's words, CEO of World Business Council, we've seen the finance ministers, we've seen Mark Carney, governor of the Bank of England, kick off a task force for business to look at material risks from climate change, of which are related to Arctic change in some complicated way. So we're seeing the major shifts that are happening. Yes, there's other resources in the Arctic, but I think the real new business model is the circular economy. And that's not just me saying that. I work with 10% of global GDP, CEOs of 200 of the world's biggest companies that are trying to change the way they've done business. And I think that's really important. It's not about saying, can we have this or that, and we have to make a choice. It is about a new paradigm, and there are opportunities in that. But let's be realistic. There are going to be winners, and there are going to be losers. And the losers are the ones that are going to focus on the old business model, which is, let's take the resources that we've always taken and use them and minimize a little bit of the damage. That's not going to be the new economy.
Erling?
Thank you. I agree to a very large extent with Gail, and I think Christiana gave a very good description of the overwhelming dilemma that the world is in. But still, if you look at the projections of how, for instance, the energy mix is going to be in the future, there are various projections. Bloomberg makes one, IEA makes another one, and whether in 2050 there will be 30% of the energy mix coming from hydrocarbons, or whether it's 20% comes from hydrocarbons, is not really important because we don't really know that. But the matter of fact is that there will be oil and gas in the energy mix even in 2050, in all projections that at least, in all projections. Another interesting fact that sometimes is overlooked is if we want to maintain, or if we want to actually produce 20% of the energy that the world requires in 2050 from oil and gas, we need to develop more oil and gas fields. Because the fields that are in production today, they won't be able, most of them will have run dry by then. So some projections say that even within the 2-degree scenario, the world needs to replace its oil and gas producing assets with the equivalent of the total reserves of Iraq every second year. So there is still a large need in order to meet the demands of the world for more resource exploitation. And if we can do that responsibly in the Arctic should be one of the candidates. If we can do it commercially and economically in the Arctic should be one of the candidates where that oil and gas and other resources should come from. We are very familiar with the discussion about stranded assets. I can assure you the big oil and gas companies and the big mineral companies in the world, they know a lot about calculating risks and estimating risks. They take that into account to a very large extent already. But we can't talk ourselves out of the one important part of the dilemma that the requirements for feedstock for petrochemical industry will grow and will continue for a very long time. I mean, oil and gas is not only energy, it's plastics. It's most of what this room is made of apart from wood. So we all so dearly want to solve this problem, but there is a huge dilemma, and we shouldn't talk ourselves out of the dilemma by ignoring some of the most fundamental facts. Christiana pointed to them. The world population is growing. The world population will keep demanding energy and minerals and metals and food, also from the Arctic. So the key then is to find, and Gail, you might disagree with using the words, but it has to do about finding responsible ways of doing that has a minimal effect on the environment in the Arctic or the climate for that matter.
Okay, thanks. I just want to go to Aslak, and maybe you can address the very specific question whether the Sami Council supports the extractive industries in the Arctic, but also the broader question that we had, which is are those industries a threat or a benefit to Arctic peoples?
Yes, and you asked also that why should Arctic be different from other parts of the world when thinking about oil and gas industries. Yet we know that there are some big risks and unanswered questions in the Arctic extraction of this oil and gas. And we also know that we have to bend the curve on emissions. So it would seem natural to not utilize those resources that carry high risks. And we have to be more efficient. We have to use less and recycle more. If the demand is growing, we have to find where we fill that need. To your specific question, if Sami Council supports extractive industries, no, I cannot say that we support, nor can I say that we don't support, because we simply cannot talk on behalf of all the Sami communities with their specific conditions. But what we can say is that we have to think who are the traditional users of the territory in question, and that their consent has to be gained in order to any development project to happen there. And I must say that the coexistence of our traditional livelihoods and extractive industries, it can be very challenging, if not impossible.
Okay. Thanks for that. I mean, so there are many different indigenous communities that live in the Arctic. About 4 million people live there. And if you look at Alaska as one example, you know, the suicide rate amongst men in Alaska is 4 times that of the average for the United States. Now, there's a number of reasons for that, but one of them is issue over actually their livelihoods. And we have a phrase in the UK called NIMBYism. It's not in my backyard. And, you know, there are risks and threats associated with extractive industries wherever you do them. And I'm not sure I necessarily hear something very particular about the Arctic being somewhere that, you know, it should be like a NIMBY area as opposed to any other part of the world. But we can come on to that. I think now is a good time actually to open up the discussion to the floor and take questions from the audience. So do we have, okay. So I think what we'll do is take we'll take 3 questions at a time, and we'll run through those, and you know they may be related, and then we'll kind of see how that goes. So if you, do you want to just, there's a mic behind and or mic in front, and just introduce yourself as well. That would help.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Oscar Bruce. I'm a PhD student in Leuven, working in urban climate. And I heard you talking about global emissions, about population growth, but I didn't hear you talking about urban areas, actually, which are really drivers of the Anthropocene. And so in this urbanizing world, where actually people are less and less connected with nature, and where they actually can't feel climate change that much, I would like to know how you actually take into account those urban impacts in your models, and also how you give guidance afterwards and feedbacks on those results to policies to act accordingly for mitigation of those impacts. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think I saw some other hands up. Yeah. Do you want to go to the mic and briefly introduce yourself? And
I'm a PhD student at Institute of Geodesy, Stuttgart. I heard a lot about that there's a need of extracting oil in Arctic because there's a growing need. But why are we not focusing on biofuels and other opportunities, which would be, I would say, one way to go? And secondly, second person mentioned that we need plastic also. A lot of plastic is there, but a lot of plastic is not recycled. And I think we have a lot of plastic on Earth that, if we recycle, then we can use it, I think, maybe for the next 100, 200 years. So why there is so much urgency to explore Arctic and instead of saving it? So I really cannot still find a link that why are we not looking at other options also? So could you please add more onto that?
okay, thanks for that. Okay, sorry, I missed you. Yeah, far away.
Hello, I'm Marcus Kaiser. I'm a PhD student at the Alfred Wegener Institute. And my question is, we often demand certainty from science, but in fact we have to deal with the uncertainties that we have to make decisions. So why not think of a more positive way of tackling the problem? If we think of solidarity also to the Arctic, why not think of an insurance fund where the industry and the different society puts money in, so we can deal with the uncertainties of climate and also with the uncertainties of endangering the environment via exploiting the resources this would be in a way a responsible way of exploiting resources worldwide, and it would account for the uncertainties that we have to deal with.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we had something on an urbanizing world and the impacts of that urbanization on the rest of the world, and also, I think, perceptions of people as they become more removed from natural environment, biofuels and plastic recycling, and I think the last was focusing on, I don't know, you might call it Global Climate Insurance Fund or something like that. So, who wants to kick off? Yeah, Christiana.
A couple of things. First, on the new urbanism, as I think of it, quite a bit going on in the minds of urban planners and designers in terms of the new cities, because the fact is that we're going to be building thousands more cities, certainly in Asia, which is where population is growing most. And already embedded into that design of new cities is precisely the responsible use of all types of resources, energy, water, space being the most scarce resource in cities. And two very exciting examples are the new capital city that China is building next to Beijing as a new capital city, and the new capital city that Egypt is building right next to Cairo, both with really very integrated designs of energy. First, what type of energy is being used there, developed there, and delivered, how the energy is being used, water, food, transportation, all of the areas that have to do with how do we answer climate change. So I think cities are a very, very exciting area where we're actually answering climate change, because everything to do with transportation, with energy, with use of space, land use, with the building environment, with energy efficiency, all of that is actually being, and all of those are the policy measures that we need to undertake for answering climate change. They're all being dealt with in an integrated way in the new urbanism. So actually very, very exciting space, much more difficult in the global north, because there we're not building new cities, we have to retrofit, and that is actually a much bigger challenge. But yes, cities actually part of the huge envelope of response and positive response to climate change. On projections of oil, I just wanted to come back to that very quickly. Fully agree that that all of the projections still have oil and gas in them, but I do, mark that each of those projections, as they come out year on to year, have a certain pattern to them. They have less and less coal existing in them, and I would argue that coal is definitely moving into the arc of history because of its carbon intensity. But the next ones, if you think of all of our fuels will disappear out of the economy in exact proportion to their carbon intensity. So the first one that needs to go and is going is coal. But then, I'm sorry to say, oil and gas, admittedly a bridge fuel, but will also go because of their carbon intensity. And so each one, in fact, even IEA in their projections every year, what they forecast, they always tend to forecast less than what is possible. We're already at 23.7% of energy generation is already from renewables and growing. And every time the IEA has to sort of catch up with itself and project more and more renewable energy in the matrix, because they haven't actually really incorporated the exponential growth of renewable energies, and how, of course, and I know that Erling, that you're going to say that oil and gas needs to be there, or particularly natural gas, to balance off the variability of renewable energy, and that is true for the time being. It is not a permanent truth. It is a current truth. In any event, I do think that this is not what is important to understand, is that none of this is a static reality. It is all a very, very quickly changing reality that is changing every single day, one concrete example. We already have Siemens having come out with the announcement that within 10 years they will put electric, not vehicles, which are of course moving forward, an electric an electric airplane on the market, that electric airplane will be able to transport 100 people and have a 1,000-kilometer radius, i.e. all of the short flights here in Europe. So very, very exciting. And I think the electrification of transportation is unstoppable and is really what is eating into oil and gas as electricity becomes more and more renewable over time, over the decades, absolutely. It's not that we're going to jump into nirvana tomorrow. And third, on the insurance fund, I would say that there have been several of those attempts, some very successful. I would say in the Caribbean and in Africa, a very, very successful insurance fund that is already there, operating and actually providing for insurance compensation for the material and economic losses of high impact of climate change. Please underscore that that never is a compensation for the loss of human life, right? Because no insurance company can actually insure for that. So, so some very interesting examples already there. Where we haven't got very far is the bigger picture of what is called in the UNFCCC and the climate change negotiations, loss and damage, which is exactly the idea that you're putting forward, of potentially a global fund that will be there for the most vulnerable countries once they have adapted as far as they can, because we know that adaptability is not eternally elastic. There is some adaptability that can occur, but once they have adapted as much as they can, there still will be some impacts to which they cannot adapt, and therefore is there a possibility of a global fund called loss and damage, which would be able to kick in there. That is included in the Paris Agreement and is part of the negotiations and will probably move forward slowly, but will move forward.
Erling, I think you wanted to say something.
Thanks, and thank you also, Cristiano, for that good. I mean, it becomes more and more easy to understand why the Paris process was a success. But there are some important points. First, the question about biofuels and recycling and so on, and that is of course very important. And a lot of things are happening on looking for other ways of providing feedstock for the synthetics that we need for plastics and so on. It's still a fairly small part of the overall source for these things, but it probably will be growing. So it's not correct that it's not happening. It is really happening on a large scale. And if you see some of the large industrial corporations in the world are turning into, particularly the oil and gas companies are turning into various kinds of energy companies, taking wind, biofuels, and other things into their commercial models. It is extremely important to combat the worst climate or sources for climate change, and coal is definitely one of them. It's appalling that India is still opening up a new coal power plant almost every week, or at least every second week or something like that. Whatever that number is, it seems to be changing, but there's still a lot. We hear rumors of things changing in India. That would be good. In China, it seems to be changing. But oil and gas is it's a natural resource that has so many uses, and we have bear in mind that the problem is the emissions that comes from burning oil and gas. If we can handle that, if we can start using gas and oil, particularly gas, emission-free. There are large projects going on, and it starts to pick up on capturing and storing the CO2 from in the ground. that would be definitely a great advantage, and all the climate projection or the energy projections take into account that some sort of carbon capture will take place. Hydrogen, turning methane into hydrogen and then storing the CO2 that comes out at the production site is also very, very interesting. And if you do that, you can, for instance, people are looking into having gas power plants at the gas field site, onshore or offshore, turning the methane directly into hydrogen, or maybe even turning the methane directly into electricity and storing the CO2 that comes out from burning it on site. That is another projection. That's another very interesting technology that seems to be evolving. So there are lots of ways of keep using this fantastic energy source without or with very minimal emissions. We need to have that as part of the equation as well.
Okay. I mean, some of these issues go beyond just the Arctic, and that's inevitable. And we've touched on coal, and someone mentioned India. I think Erling actually said India opening up a coal station every whatever it is. Well, yes, okay. I mean, there's a touch of double standards here. You know, in the UK, we've been burning coal for 200 years, and actually in the West, you know, we've been pumping out CO2 from coal for far, far longer than countries like India and China have. So that's one point. And I think this is a good opportunity to throw out one of the curveball questions that we had for you guys, which was, let me just find it.
But, sorry, before we throw out a curveball,
okay.
could you just establish facts? Sorry, Erling. First of all, UK, last week.
I know.
Go for it.
I know. Yeah. So we had no coal-produced electricity for the first time in the history of the UK. But that's after.
Before the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, right. But we've been doing it for 200 years.
Yeah.
So I mean, come on. Okay, so we've just, you know, and the rest of the world is catching up. But
no, my point.
You know.
My point is that it took the UK 200 years to get to there, right? But thank God we got there, because now I live in the UK as well. So thank God, you know, we finally got there. But here's the exciting thing, that emerging countries are actually doing this much faster than the global north, right? And that is the real exciting thing, because the facts coming out of India are, A, the new regulation that has just come out that there will be no new coal before 2027. Whatever coal is there, but no more new coal extraction, no more new coal plants built until 2027, at which point they will make another decision, A. B, the projection of the Ministry of Energy of India is that they will be at 60% renewable energy in the energy matrix and in the grid by 2027. So that's actually pretty exciting. And at that point, when they're at 60% at 2027, having burned no more new coal or having opened no more new plants, then they will decide which way to go. And where I certainly agree with you, Erling, is that CCS and renewable energy are on a fantastic race in the market, right? And the market is going to decide which way do we go. Do we go with renewable energy, because then there are many other issues that have to be solved for renewable energy to take over 100%. But one of them is not capture and storage. Many others. And the other side of the race is CCS that has exactly the opposite of issues that have to be solved. And the fantastic thing is that the market is really putting their resources and their ingenuity into both of these, and they're competing against each other, which is exactly what we should see. Because we should see these technologies competing for the best solution for mankind at the cheapest price with the least environmental impact. And so, you know, sometimes the market works.
Well, that's a controversial one in its own right, actually, but that's a different topic altogether. I'll throw in this curveball question, and then we'll take some more questions from the audience. And it was, we produced these a little while ago, but it's, what are the consequences for US and global climate policies of the appointment of Scott Pruitt as EPA chief? Now, Scott was someone that has sued or attempted to sue the EPA on multiple occasions. That's the Environmental Protection Agency in the US. shall I say, I don't know, devout climate denier. That's the right phrase. But more generally, the trends that we're seeing in the US and the possibility that they may actually pull out of the Paris Agreement, and that they are the largest economy in the world, and that, you know, the sort of phrase, you know, US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold, or whatever. I mean, that it will be sending out certain messages to particularly developing countries. So that was the kind of curveball that I don't know.
You should have sent it by tweet.
I think I did actually, yeah, but I haven't got however many million followers, so it didn't really work. Yeah. I guess, Christiana, do you want to, you know, so the US, the biggest economy in the world is going in the wrong direction. And, you know, there will be impacts, consequences.
Yes, there will be impacts, but this is not a showstopper. This is not a showstopper. So first of all, you know, we don't know what this administration is going to do, because that depends on whether it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. And so that's the first, you know, issue. So, you know, eventually they shall decide what they're going to do. And there are many options, as you know, and any time about anything in life, there are many options. So the most dramatic is that they could choose to exit the convention, and because the Paris Agreement is under the convention, then they would exit both at the same time, and that would take a year, have huge diplomatic consequences, and frankly, I am still racking my brain to figure out what would they gain by it. But if anybody has a good idea, please do let me know or send me a tweet. The second less dramatic option would be to stay in the convention and exit the Paris Agreement, which would take 4 years, by which time you know who would be leaving the White House. And that also has huge diplomatic consequences internationally. And again, I really am still racking my brain to see what the advantage of that would be, considering that all of the contributions that every single country, or 189 countries, have made under the Paris Agreement are not legally binding. The agreement itself, the process of increasing your contribution over time, and the reporting requirements are legally binding, but the numbers are not, and that was deliberately so for many other reasons that didn't have to do with the United States. So I really don't understand what they would gain, since those numbers are not legally binding. So that's the legalistic answer. The economic answer, which is perhaps more interesting, is that should the United States even stay in the convention and stay in Paris, anyway, but decide that they would, in fact, pull back on the incentives and the regulations that they have now for decarbonizing their industry, they're only hurting themselves, because the fact is that the world is unstoppably decarbonizing the global economy, and that those products and services that are increasingly decarbonized are going to be the competitive products of the future. In fact, they are, to a large extent, already the services and products of the present. And so to insist that in the 21st century, you absolutely really want to hang on to your landline, despite the fact that everybody else has actually already moved to a cell phone. It just doesn't...
I'm going to interrupt you, but I mean, you're talking about rational thought processes there. So that's
sorry about that. I apologize.
Right.
I know that that's not very much in vogue. I thought this was about science.
But Julianne, you still have NSIDC affiliation, and you know you still work with a lot of US scientists. So I feel particularly under threat under this administration. Did you want to say a couple of words about that?
Well, I think the jury is still out, at least in terms of how it's going to be impacting science in the U.S. So, in terms of, you know, for example, the NSF budget, you know, we don't know yet in terms of funding for geosciences and how that's going to be impacted. And so, you know, it's a little bit hard to make any projections right now. But I really agree with what Christiane has been saying, in that even in the U.S., the economics is really driving the use of renewable energy. So even if you have a president that wants to push more coal extraction or more oil and gas extraction, the industries are not going to be as competitive anymore with renewables. And I think you see that in the U.S. as well. And I think that's going to be really helping to lead the charge.
Let's take some more.
Jonathan, if I could add from a global business perspective, I think I would really like to emphasize what Christiana and Juliana has said. This is not a showstopper. Global business is on a trajectory, not all of it, but a significant portion of it that is for deep decarbonization. 100 major multinational companies that are U.S.-based wrote in to the U.S. administration saying, keep your Paris Agreement commitments. So this is not just, a demigod able to do whatever they want. We've got the state of California, which is a huge, massive economy on its own right, still actively on deep decarbonization. Yeah. So I think this is not a solo show. I think the role for science in this world, and whether that's U.S.-based science or wherever you are based, is actually give your scientific facts to those that are trying to push the deep decarbonization economy. So I think business needs science, and I think it needs it now more than ever. I think that's important. Big business does scenario planning. Erling talked about that. They do risk analysis, but it's important that they get that science right into the boardroom. So for example, Shell, major multinational oil company, they've been doing scenario planning on risk and climate change for a number of years. What's very interesting, though, is they miss some basic science. When a scientist who I know went into the boardroom to look at those scenarios, he didn't challenge them on their climate scenarios. He could have done. He chose to say, none of your scenarios has brought in ocean acidification at all.
I think that is a really important point, and it's a really important point for all of you, the audience, because they need the science, they need the facts. And actually, the whole panel will be around during the coffee break, and Gail is someone who has that way into big business. And so, if you want to give them the facts, talk to people on the panel. That also links, though, to something that Julianne said, which is that she feels, or perhaps knows, I don't know, that funding for science, I don't know, funding for science in the Arctic perhaps is weakening, and you talked about the satellite program in particular, and we may touch on that. But do we have other? Yeah, please come up and introduce yourself and fire away. Hit them hard. Yeah. Okay, don't hold back.
Rob Wilson, I'm a paleoclimatologist from St Andrews. So this is following on from the science question. There was a question about reduced funding, and we still need to continue developing new data sets and so forth. So what is the role of the IPCC now? We've had, say, the last 3 reports. Basically, the final conclusion has not changed. Yep. So should the role of the IPCC now change, rather than just a summary every 5, I mean, it's already 4 years since the last one, so God knows what they're doing with regards to what the next is. Should the role of the IPCC change to focus strategic research into areas that will reduce uncertainty in appropriate areas that can move the debate forward?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, actually. And you could broaden it beyond that. Should we even be worried about what's going to happen rather than fixing the problem? But yeah, go on.
Hello, I'm Jukka Käyhkö from Turku, Finland. I'm a geographer. I have a practical what-if question for you guys. What do you think would be the consequences, for either good or bad, if we somehow could decide, make an agreement not to touch the Arctic resources?
Yeah. Do we? Roloff. Yeah.
So hello everybody, my name is Roelof Rietbroek from the University of Bonn. I was wondering, seeing this nice picture of the Arctic, what's the best legal instrument you have at the moment to enforce policy and how to monitor it?
Well, that is also a great question, because it's not an unregulated area. There's national territories and governments controlling them. Good, all right. So we had the 3 questions. funding and the IPCC. What should be the role of the IPCC? What should their focus be? Now, perhaps, you know, it's 95% certain, or whatever the number they had on some of these key things, particularly anthropogenic impacts on climate change. Agreement on, you know, if we had an agreement on a moratorium on using or new Arctic resources, and the third was, remind me, the legal instrument, yeah, in the Arctic. You know, what are the mechanisms? So, Aslak, do you want to comment on, you know, a moratorium on exploitation of Arctic resources, and what the, you know, representing your organisation, what the Sami people and council would, what their views on that would be?
Yeah, well, this what if question was interesting, because yeah, I would think that that would be a bright situation for us if there would be no new extractive industries in the north. But yeah, you mentioned this nimbism, not in my backyard, and yeah, obviously I have to admit that Sami don't live sustainably at the moment, and if we are to reach that level, then everybody has to change their ways of consuming and living, and it touches also Sami. And we have lived without fossil fuels or minerals, so it is possible. But it doesn't mean that we have to go back to the Stone Age to get back there. And also there are many scenarios of 100% renewable energy globally. It is possible, no one can say that it's not possible, but it means that we have to change our way of living, our way of consuming, and it touches also Sami. And I would think a key aspect in this is that we have to make more out of less. We have to use less. And let's say if we cannot have more reindeer, then we know we have to make more out of the few that we have, or out of what we have. So we have to increase the value. We have to get better at developing products. Reindeer is a wonderful animal. You can use every part of it. So we have to learn how to market that and how to increase the value in that way. And we have a lot of other wonderful products in the Arctic that could be used. And I'm not talking about extractive natural resources, but other. We have a lot of food items that haven't really been developed to reach a real market value, but I see some real potential there.
Okay, thanks. Nella, did you want to maybe
yes,
legal instruments?
Well, I can go into that also. I think we are discussing a global issue, the climate challenge, and global challenges need global solutions. So, and then regarding the Arctic and the oil extraction, oil is one part of the development. We, I think, need to discuss whole development and whole sustainability, both in the region but also in the whole world. Most of the pollution to the Arctic comes by long transported ways through the oceans, through the atmosphere, and these are pollutions that are transported to the Arctic from the Americas, from Asia, from Europe. So I think it's healthy for us, all of us, to think in global challenges and global solutions. We've just recently, there were several papers showing also the plastic now coming up as a great pollution, and we are talking about 2 or 3 billion more people living on this earth. We need to feed them. Climate challenge is a great challenge also to how we are going to feed into the future. Therefore, we are looking into the oceans, and we have to keep our oceans clean. So there are many issues, and these are complicated issues, but we have to think globally and wholesome in these issues. I can, if Erling lets me, I'll press the button on your figure and show the Arctic, because we are discussing also the societies in the Arctic. And I may also perhaps ask you, how many are you living in the Arctic? Raise your hands. Yes?
To a certain extent, all of us are.
Well, not necessarily. No. So the Arctic is, even though we are talking about one Arctic, but the Arctic, as Erling was also saying, there is not one Arctic necessarily. The Arctic has areas that are very different from each other. And as you can see up there, the most populated, I live in Tromsø, and it's Arctic. So quite a large portion of the Norwegian community also lives in the Arctic, not only the indigenous people. So it's therefore an area that is it's the backyard of Norway, basically. That's where we live, that's where our economy part of it is. So it's a larger issue.
Okay, we've got input from Gail and Erling. And the question about what the role of the IPCC should be moving forward, I think, is a good one, which we should address at some point. Gail, did you want to say something?
I do. I think that all three questions really speak to the need to have a global dialogue on the Arctic. I think Arctic issues are too siloed still. I think they are either siloed in science, but certainly siloed in discussions. Now, I think the Arctic Council has done a great job of bringing together regional issues, multi-stakeholder issues within that. They've brought in some external observers in terms of other country governments that are interested in the Arctic. But what Christiana said to the comment here, and the microphone wasn't on, so I just want to repeat it, was that we all do live in the Arctic, and I think that's a very, very profound insight. We are living in the impacts of the Arctic. We affect the Arctic, we're part of it. So it's not somewhere else. And I think that's really important. I cannot answer almost any of those questions because I think we need to do deeper and more robust risk analysis from a global perspective. Whether that's on regulation, whether that's on how to develop the Arctic, under what scenarios would a moratorium make sense globally and for the region. How do we do those things? And I think it is about global risk analysis, and that's why we brought the Arctic to Davos. Because it should not only be discussed in the Canadian High Arctic, in Tromsø. It needs to be discussed in places like Switzerland, where we have world leaders coming in that want to take a look at things like Arab Spring, but they should be also taking a look at the Arctic. So I think they're all important questions, but it's about global risk analysis, and we need to do that better.
No, that's a very well-made point. I take that. Erling.
Just very quickly, I think one of the first points I made, and that has been repeated by some of you guys in the panel, is that there are different Arctics. So if we're starting to discuss a moratorium on the Arctic, then the first discussion you have to have is which part of the Arctic are we talking about. There are the Arctic Circle, which is on that illustration, is not, in my opinion, a good definition of Arctic, because that takes out a lot of modern part of Europe, for instance. Almost half of Scandinavia, and things like that. So, but if we were to put a moratorium on new, and I guess you're pointing to extractive industries, not fisheries or reindeer husbandry or whatever. We have to remember that you are then not only putting a moratorium on industrial activity in that area, but you're also imposing some quite important influence or activity that will directly affect the people living in the Arctic. So you are in a way saying that you have to find other ways of developing your societies into modern societies than the rest of the world that has where industrial activity and extractive industries are permissible. So I do not think it is a good idea. I just have to stress that. When it comes to legal instruments, or that question on legal instruments, which also is very important or very interesting question, we have to bear in mind that the Arctic has, I think it's, I probably dare say that it has been a peaceful region for the entire human history. The countries in the Arctic are cooperating. They are talking together. They are cooperating quite closely. The Arctic Council is a very good example of that. My country, Norway, has never been at war with Russia, and we have been cooperating. We have been distributing fishery resources with Russia throughout the Cold War, very successfully. So there is a tradition in the Arctic of cooperating. Arctic Council, as I said, with the 8 Arctic nations and the 6 indigenous peoples groups, is a success in that respect as well. And there is a new, and I will use this opportunity to mention to those who don't know, there is a new Arctic organization emerging, or it has been operating for 3 or 4 years, and that is the Arctic Economic Council, consisting of the same 8 countries and the same 6 indigenous peoples groups in the Arctic, and are influencing, are discussing, and a lot of policy or economic policy issues throughout the Arctic. Although it's not necessarily a legislative instrument, Arctic Council and Arctic Economic Council are proofs that cooperation between the nations is actually taking part in the Arctic, and we need to exploit that in order to achieve what we are really talking about here at this,
all right,
this debate.
That's a good point. Yes, thanks for that. So we're rapidly running out of time, and I'm not going to attempt to summarize, all of the things we've covered. Okay, it's quite difficult. It's a tricky problem. But I thought and I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I thought I'd give the panel the opportunity to just sort of, half a minute each, if you've got any final thoughts or final messages that you want to put out there, in closing this debate. Julianne.
I guess I would just like to say is that we cannot keep putting carbon in the atmosphere. I mean, we cannot do that. We are all ice-dependent species. It's not just the people that live in the Arctic. It's not just the species that are dependent on the ice in the Arctic. We are all dependent on that ice. And so we have to move to a different economy. I mean, this is the time when we have to do it. Otherwise, we are going to not have a planet that's habitable for us.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe I can do my closing remarks referring to the IPCC. Would that be helpful?
Great.
So the IPCC, as you know, does put out a 5-yearly report, but they also put out special reports. And one of the most important reports they're putting out is next year, the report on the 1.5 degrees. They will do a scientific analysis of that, but also, to your point, the achievability of it. How achievable is it? What are the solutions that we could enact in order to stay within 1.5 a maximum temperature rise? And that is going to be a crucial report, because the fact is that they will come out and say, in order to stay at 1.5, we must bend the emissions curve by 2020. And the important thing about that is that it allows for the gradual transformation of the economy. Nobody wants to push any part of the economy, least of all the oil and gas industry, to have to do what Mark Carney calls a jump to distress. Nobody is interested in that. So in order to allow for a certain decadal transformation and transition toward the new carbon-less economy, we have to be able to bend the curve by 2020 and thereby protect the 1.5.
Anyone else? We are running out of time, but yeah, go. Okay. Aslak?
Yeah, if we're talking about legal instruments, then I have to mention the United...
We're wrapping up now.
I am wrapping up with this because I think it should be a key legal instrument in development projects in the Arctic. Because as we see, a lot of the Arctic areas are indigenous peoples' areas. So I mean the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Because that would help us to remember that there are more peoples in the Arctic than there are states. And no one can talk on behalf of indigenous peoples except us ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. Gail?
I'd just like to close by reiterating the fact that now is the time for science to engage with progressive business that's trying to get to the low carbon economy. We need you and your insights to help business understand that they are an ice-dependent species. It's a great phrase, Juliana. So please help us. We need a rapid response team from science to help business understand the global risks from the Arctic. Thank you.
Okay. Naila.
Regarding the IPCC, every year we publish scientists, thousands of new knowledge. We need somebody to assess that science. So we still need the IPCC reports. And in a time where the Arctic and the whole global environment is changing so rapidly, we need this knowledge even more so.
Okay. Well, that's a great point to sorry, to almost close on.
5 seconds.
Erling, go on.
5 seconds. Don't close the Arctic for business. Yeah. But find ways of using the resources to the benefit of the world in a responsible way.
Well, actually, that's a very good point to close on. Well, wow. I mean, we covered an awful lot of territory in an hour and a half. I'd like to thank you all for coming along at 8:30 on a Thursday morning. But I would really, really like to thank our fantastic panel for a really stimulating and provocative discussion about a complex and difficult topic. So please show your appreciation. Finally, as you're leaving, I'll just advert that we have a union session in this room after the coffee break on Make Facts Great Again, how we can stand up for science. Do come along to that too.